Hello, good afternoon, and welcome. Great to see you, and it would be absolutely fantastic if you could turn your cameras on. It just gives a nicer experience for everyone who's looking at well, certainly gives a nicer experience for me, because I hate looking at screens and, not knowing if there's anyone out there. So, and I recognize some faces as well, which is absolutely great. So I'm going to be talking about the path towards zero trust, with a particular focus on Microsoft 365, and Azure AD. All right, so that's the intention. So what I'm going to go back to now is my screen share. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background on myself, just in case you've not come across me before, I started work in computing a long time ago, and I designed real-time control systems. I got involved in both the hardware and the software design, mainly focused on the software in terms of we were developing very high-speed real-time controllers. I've actually worked with every version of Windows, believe it or not. Some of the very early versions, the amount of work was just picking them up and so taking them across and putting them somewhere where I wouldn't have to see the floppy disks again. But I was looking for a front-end management system for our very high-speed real-time controllers. And when MT came along, I started working with that and thinking we could use it. Got involved with the product group. One day, someone in the product group gave me a stack of floppies and say, "Hey, why don't you have a look at this?" And this was a very early precursor for what was to become on-prem AD. In about 1999, I got a call from Microsoft UK saying, "We hear you know something about Active Directory." And I said, "Well, I've worked with the product group on it and fed back information." And they said, "Can you come and tell us about it?" Which was a very surreal moment. But that formed my sort of real relationship with Microsoft. I'm now a Microsoft MVP. I got really drawn into identity in a very big way around about 2002. And that was with Federation. And it was an IBM system, no Microsoft there at all. But then, of course, ADFS came along, and we're federating with Microsoft products as well. I've been speaking at international events since 1999. Absolutely love doing that. It's very nice to report that in-person events is coming back, and I was in Lucerne last week in Switzerland. Absolutely lovely location for it. Great. It was the Workplace Ninja conference. Really great conference. Really interesting to be speaking there. Now, one of the things I like is always a challenge. And I was about to give a keynote. Well, the keynote was to be the following day. And somebody from the company, from marketing, said, "We always like to set our speakers a challenge." And I said, "Yes, and what's that?" And they said, "Oh, just to bring in a phrase into your presentation." And this slide I developed to bring in just the phrase they wanted me to bring in. And I think you'll realize what the phrase is as we're going through. It's the most difficult one to bring into a normal presentation on identity. But actually, having produced this slide just to really satisfy that need, I found it quite a useful slide. So our prime objective really is to protect our assets. And we've been doing that for years and years. So we protect things, we put them in safes, we put alarm systems around, have really good locks, sturdy doors. If we've got a sort of very high value asset, we will probably put that, in a secure garage of some time, making sure we've got, all the electronics possible to stop someone stealing that asset. And, that even applies to farmers who have got their smooth, hairless pigs that they need to protect. And what are they protecting them from? They're actually protecting them from the sun, and they're rubbing on the sun cream. So probably you've guessed what it was the smooth, hairless pig that I had to bring into the presentation. But it's true. We're all about protecting assets. And if we go back to once upon a time days, what we did is we built castles to protect assets. And the interesting thing about the castle was you might have extremely thick, strong walls, battlements on top, but you had to have a way in. And the way in was really protected. And we had layers of defense on the way in. You'd have a moat, probably. You would then have a portcullis. And if somebody attacked, got across the moat, got through the portcullis, you'd then have these things called killing boxes, which you were shoveling the enemy through so you could get them. But if you take it to if we're not under an attack situation, how did someone enter the castle? They crossed the drawbridge, went through the portcullis, probably examined by a gatekeeper of some kind who checked out some form of credentials for that person, allowed them in. But once they were in, they were pretty much trusted to move around the castle. And we did exactly the same thing when we designed IT systems. We had our network, and we have firewalls to protect the network. We have our equipment, and we protect our equipment through surrounding with building control. But if we're using a protocol such as Kerberos, so it's on-prem AD, we authenticate once. And once we've authenticated, we end up with a thing called a TGT, which is a ticket granting ticket. And I can go back with that ticket granting ticket at any time to Kerberos server and say, hey, please can I have a session ticket to a particular server, right? And the session tickets, if I was going to server 1, the actual content of that session ticket would be the same as if I was going to server 2, same as if I was going to server 3. That's in terms of the identity content. The ticket itself would be encrypted differently, would be encrypted just for the particular server, but the actual content, my identity, my group membership would be actually identical. So I was let through the door when I logged in, I got a TGT, and now I can go off and get a session ticket to any server without further validation of who I am. Okay. Also, if we look at this scenario, what we've got is we go back and say, hey, can I have a session ticket, please, to server 3? And I get one, right? There's no consideration is, that character, John, is he allowed a session ticket to server 3? No, if I've got a TGT, I just get one. And all of the authorization decisions have to be done by the target system. Okay. That sort of worked when we were, very much isolated. But now as we evolve into the 21st century, we've got our users, and our users are no longer within our security boundary. So our users could be absolutely anywhere. And we want them to have access to our on-premise data, but equally well, we might be putting data into the cloud, and we want to give them access to that. We might be using third-party SaaS apps. So a typical example of that, of course, is Microsoft 365. We need to be able to give them access to that. And then, of course, at one time, the device we were going to use was within our security boundary, completely controlled by our IT department. But now, the standard is we can use pretty much any device. Well, there might be certain restrictions on that. The idea is we're not going to stop that user working. So they got their phone. Yes, we want them to be able to use that. They've got their tablet. We want them to use that. They've got their laptop again. So that's the change for our users. But then we've got collaboration going on. And we're going to bring in partners. And we want to give partners access to our data. So we've got to deal with that situation. And then very importantly, bringing in consumers. So the corporate landscape has completely changed. At one time, you could say users in our IT system or our identity system were employees. Of course, now they're employees, they're partners, and they're customers. Users worked in the office. Well, those days are long gone, especially COVID helped make the huge shift that's happened. And, you know, I know some companies are desperately trying to get people to come back in the office. I know a lot of people who have actually moved jobs to make sure they don't have to go back in the office. So the reality is users are working from anywhere and they need to be productive from anywhere. So they're going to be bringing their own devices of some kind. So we need to add that into the mix. So devices used to be corporate owned, locked down by our IT department, no more. Apps were on premises. Now apps could actually be absolutely anywhere. They could be on-prem, they could be in a private cloud, they could be in a public cloud, they could be our data that we're using or the app we're using could be a software as a service application. Hackers have changed as well. So hackers started off by being opportunists. Now they're highly funded syndicates or national state actors. And what a hacker, you know, ransomware attacks we've all heard of, but there's a significant number of attacks going on now where it's purely to stop your organization being operational. So they're not interested in encrypting your data and saying, hey, you know, pay us all these Bitcoins and we'll unencrypt it. All they're interested in is stopping you operating. And then users access resources. Well, it's now very much users and workloads. Workloads have always been involved, and a workload is just if you like, a service principal. So it's an application or it's a managed identity in Azure. So our landscape completely changed. We need to deal with it. We need to work within this new environment. There's no point in trying to change the environment. This is life as it is now. So what we need to do is trust nobody without continuously evaluating them. So when somebody's operating, we need to continuously make an evaluation. So we're going to try and eliminate the hackers getting in. But, you know, reality is you may well have somebody who's compromised your system, and what you need to do is know about it. Okay, so this term zero trust, what does it really mean? And zero trust is there are three primary tenets of zero trust. Number one is verify explicitly. So we're going to continuously verify resource access. So we're going to do that based on the user's identity, but also on the environment. So where is that user? Are they on-prem? Have they moved off-prem? Have they moved country? Right, which might be an important one as well. What about their device? Is their device healthy? Does it meet our compliance that we need? What about their risk? And when we're talking about risk, we could be talking about user risk, or we could be talking about sign-in risk. So user risk is where we detect leaked credentials. So that user is definitely at risk, and we need to respond to it. Or it could be that user is signing in from a location, right? So it's a sign-in risk they've never signed into from before. Or they might be coming out of an anonymous IP address. So they're using some kind of Tor, or they could be coming from an IP address that has been identified as maybe a command and control center IP address, you know, so, or an address that's been compromised in some way. So verifying all the time that that person is allowed to carry on accessing one of our resources. The next thing we need to do, absolutely, is implement least privilege. And yes, we'll have users, you know, who are least privileged completely, but then we'll have admins. And the problem with admins is they do an administrative role, but then they also do other roles as well. And what you don't want is when an administrator is doing their email, if they get a email that is actually trying to compromise the system, what we want to do is make sure they're using least privilege at that point in time. And it's all about limiting blast radius. again, if we give an administration role of some kind, something goes wrong, we don't want that to affect the whole of our directory. We want to be able to limit that in some way. So controlling that blast radius. So we verify all the time. You use least privilege and things should go well. However, what you have to do also is assume breach. So whatever defenses you put in, you need to assume that a breach will occur. So what you need is early warning of that breach. So you need to be monitoring your systems, doing your analytics on your systems, detecting threats, improving protection. So as you see threats, can we improve our protection? And also we might well do automated remediation of some kind. So those are our three tenets: verify explicitly, use least privilege, and assume breach. Where did the term zero trust came from? Well, it's interesting, actually. It was a term originally coined by Forrester back in 2010. The Open Group, NIST, and others did quite a lot of work on it. Gartner came up with a similar term, which was Secure Access Service Edge. And there's considerable overlap, particularly now as we take zero trust and extend that down onto the network as well. So they're pretty much the same thing. Do we have to trust? And the answer is absolutely yes. There has to be a point of trust. If we're bringing a user into our environment, we have to trust something. The key is not to trust it for too long. So we need to continuously re-evaluate. I've got a sort of industry set of references there. If you look at the video later, you can see those. Controls have got to apply to identities. And when we talk about identities, we're talking about users, we're talking about admins, and we're talking about workloads. So we need to be able to control those identities. Endpoints. So our endpoints, they might be managed, right? So they might be managed, they might be joined to an on-prem domain and managed through group policy, right? Or we might have them managed in some way through our MDM solution. So we've got managed, and we've got also bring your own device, which is going to probably be an unmanaged. Although if we're going to deploy, allow corporate apps to be deployed on there and allow them to access corporate data, we may well want to control and bubble that corporate data and protect that. Applications. So what are applications? It could be an application sitting in the Microsoft cloud. It could be an application sitting in any provider, so it's software as a service provider. It could be our on-prem apps, and it could be our on-prem apps which are using sort of federated authentication protocols, or perhaps using legacy protocols. And then, we're accessing data, and what we need to be able to do is manage how that data is accessed. Do we want to make sure that, maybe if we're downloading data, we could block it completely, or maybe we'll only allow the download of PDFs, or only download data that hasn't been categorized as sensitive in some way. And a typical example of that categorization might be that, there's credit card information inside the data, and we might want to block that download, but maybe, other types of download we will allow. That's pretty much it when we're looking at the M365 Azure AD focus. But if you're going beyond that, then we're looking at, IoT, the Internet of Things, where we're looking at OT, which is your operational technologies that's running your production infrastructure. And of course, we're looking at networks. So we've got to apply controls to all of this. There's an interesting slide, which I've just borrowed from the Open Group. And this is their sort of components of zero trust. So we have our users, we have our devices, and what we're going to have to do is when those users and devices are trying to get at our assets, what we need to do is push them through a security policy enforcement of some kind. And that security policy enforcement will be getting lots of signals, but it will also be using threat intelligence. So threat intelligence that's been gathered from within our ecosystem, but also from outside it. So from the global system that maybe our identity provider is managing. So the more information our identity provider has to work on, the better that threat intelligence is going to be. What's going to be very, very important is that we wrap this and we wrap it with modern security operations. So we need to, and those security operations will feed into the threat intelligence, and we need to add governance into the frame as well. And the whole idea, of course, is what we're doing is it's asset protection. Okay, nice idea. There's a huge amount of work involved in this. And the other thing is it's all about balance. What we need to do is really balance the need to block out the bad guys, right, but still allow our users to operate. I mean, if I had a server and I wanted to 100% protect that server, I could disconnect it from the network, disconnect from the power, lock it in a safe, and it would be perfectly protected. Problem is, of course, it's not usable. And it's about empowering our users to work, but equally well protecting our assets. And to do this, it's going to involve absolutely everyone. It's not a cheap operation. There's going to be the need for money. There's going to be need to buy in from your technical leads, your architects, operations, educators. We're going to have to do a lot of education of the missing one off there is our users. Our users have to buy into this. Our users become knowledgeable about what's going on in a really heavily protected system. So it's not a quick journey. But before you start the journey, one thing I would say is if you haven't got it turned on, and I'm sure an awful lot of you have got MFA enabled, please turn it on as soon as you can. And, you could say, well, we haven't got authenticators, apps on our phones, etc. Well, just use SMS, use text-based MFA. Although it's not the best solution, it's a perfect solution for sort of low-hanging fruit attacks, because a lot of attacks they're about password spray attacks. If you've got a targeted attack against someone and you're going to be doing things like SIM hijacking, etc., then SMS based is not going to do it for you. But for your 90%, well, 99% of your personnel, probably any form of MFA is better than none. Well, actually, sorry, any form of MFA for 100% of your personnel is better than none. The other question you should ask yourself is, are you ransomware recovery ready? It's the 3 R's. Really put your hand on your heart, think about it. If my infrastructure was totally flattened today, right, could I recover? And what it means is by totally flattened is you've had the attacker inside your environment for quite some time. They've learned everything they need to know about that environment. So they know how you do your backups, right? So they know how you do absolutely everything. When it's time to attack, and it's normally on a Friday night, the attack starts, they might encrypt. They might encrypt. But these days, sometimes it's just about killing your organization. And you absolutely need to be able to recover from that. So you need your backups air-gapped so that you know that you can actually back up and restore, you can restore your systems. So really think about that. because you could spend a fortune going down the zero trust. You get buy-in from your your chief financial officer, you get buy-in at board level from everyone else. You go down that route and you're spending money in big ways, bringing in more, bringing training on board, bringing in more maybe security analysts, and then you get flattened and you can't recover. You've wasted a lot of money. So make sure that you can absolutely recover. If we look at zero trust with Microsoft, what we really need to think about is, what are we trying to do? We are trying to decide whether a user or a workload, and that's just using a workload identity of some kind, whether a user or a workload is going to be allowed to access an application. And to go along with zero trust, we're going to constantly reevaluate that all the time. And that's our primary objective. Our primary objective of any identity and access management system is about authenticating users, workloads to applications, right? There's all sorts of things that go with it, such as, the ability to, reset passwords and all the other great things we can do. But our core objective is about authenticating users to applications. And so we're going to need to bring in those users and know about them. We're using in Azure. We need to bring them into Azure. And that's where we're going to authenticate them. So we're bringing in our, the users, we're authenticating them, workloads through Azure AD, and then we can use conditional access as our policy engine. And to make really good informed decisions, we want to bring in a lot more information. Where is that user located? What application is the client application? Is there a sign-in risk? Is there a user risk? We need to bring that sort of information in. And then we want general threat intelligence as well, bringing that in to help us make decisions. And if we make a decision and we say, yes, that user is allowed to access that application, what we're going to do is actually create a security token of some kind to allow that access to happen. But we want to bring in even more information, device information. So is it a managed device? Bring your own device. What's its health, compliance? We need to get that sort of thing. Is there a device risk which has been identified? The operating system that's in use. So we gather all of this, and then we're going to make a decision. Are we going to produce a security token which will allow access to a particular application? And when we're making this decision, we're going to, we could bring it down to a single application or a group of applications that we're controlling through a single conditional access policy. We could block and just say, no, we're going to block. Or we could say we need assurance increase. So it could be MFA, which you can also classify as remediation. We're saying you need to be two-factor authenticated, you're not, so we're going to have to get you to deal with that. We could do remediation, particularly if we've got a user risk, and what we can do is force that user to change their password, right? So if they've been identified as user risk, probably leaked credentials, something like that, we could get them to remediate by changing their password. Assuming we pass these tests, the next thing that's going to happen is we're going to go through session controls. And the beauty of session controls is, yes, this user can access this application, but as they are accessing it, we want to control the session behavior. So we've got an extra layer on there. And I'm going to come back to more details of all of this very shortly. Then in terms of zero trust with Microsoft, we need some sort of security information and event management system around there. And then we need governance. And the governance is managing sort of privileged access, resource access, and user life cycle. So we need to add that into the frame as well. Microsoft 365, it's about controlling access to 365 applications. But we can go beyond that very easily. And with Azure AD, we can bring in access to third-party apps. We can bring in access to partner apps, and we can bring access into our own applications. And applications and websites might be on-prem, they might be in the cloud. Now, if we look at the traditional security boundaries, if you take on-prem AD, security boundary is around the forest, right? So you authenticate and you've got access to anywhere in the forest. If you take a server that's sitting on the web, it might be using forms authentication, username and password into a form. Security boundary is around that web server and its identity database, right? So you're very restricted in terms of moving around. And why you're restricted, it's because of the authentication protocol. So on-prem, it's Kerberos, and with that web server, it was forms authentication. So what we need to do is to break out of this model is we absolutely need to use federated protocols. Microsoft, early days, very much championed WS federation. SAML, the absolute industry standard SAML protocol for federation. And then as we move into the more modern era, it's OpenID Connect, and OpenID Connect authenticates you to the front end, authenticates the user to a server, and OAuth 2 authorizes a server to access a back-end system, and it could be with the identity of the user, but it could actually be using a workload identity as well. So if you're developing applications and want a federated authentication protocol, now it should be OpenID Connect OAuth 2. So that now gives us access to our apps, and it doesn't matter where they are. So our security boundary has moved. It is no longer around the forms auth, database and the web server, no longer around our on-prem. It's around the security boundary is now all about authentication. Okay, you might think, but hey, what about supporting our existing applications that are using Windows Auth, that are using host header, that are using non-federated protocols? Well, Microsoft refer to that as secure hybrid access. And the idea is you have a federated protocol that authenticates you to the appliance, the network appliance, and that network appliance can then do protocol conversion. So I could authenticate to that network appliance using, OpenID Connect or 2, and then it would translate that into maybe Windows authentication. And it would do that through Kerberos constrained delegation. Network appliances, well, you've got the Azure AD application proxy, but there's lots of support for things like Acme and Citrix and F5 and Zscaler. They all behave in slightly different ways and have different extensions. But what you need to do is convert from your federated protocol to your legacy on-prem protocol. Now, if we look at the authentication story, our user hits an application, app says, "Oh, you're not authenticated," and the app sends you off to a security token service that it trusts. And in our particular case, we're using Azure AD. And there's an authentication request string. And in that string, in its simplest way, it says, "Please authenticate this user to this application," right? And it will use a particular protocol. So it might be OpenID Connect, it might be WS Federation, it might be SAML. So what happens, we end up at the tenant coming in through an endpoint, and the endpoint is specifically done for each endpoint is for each protocol. So we arrive, at the WS Federation endpoint, as it's shown there, and then we've got a gatekeeper number one. And what gatekeeper number one says, haha, are you already authenticated? And you might be, because you might have a cookie which proves that you're already authenticated to Azure AD. And I call that a priority pass. With other protocols, we might have a refresh token, which would do the same thing. If we've got a priority pass, we don't need to go through an authentication mechanism. Otherwise, the gatekeeper needs to decide what type of user we are. And we could be what I call a VIP user, which is a user from our own organization. That might be a cloud-only user. It might be a user that has come from being synced from on-prem. It might be a user using a username and password. It might be a user using passwordless, right? There are more and more authentication methods. Might be that you're using FIDO. So the gatekeeper is going to send you to the appropriate authentication booth to get authenticated. And if you're guest, we'll go to the appropriate guest booth as well. We come through that and we either have strong authentication or we have single factor authentication. So we're either MFA or single factor. How do we get through with MFA? Well, we might have already done MFA. We've supplied a cookie, which is a strong auth cookie, and that gets us in with a strong authentication. It might be that we go passwordless, in which case we're strong authentication. If we're single factor, there could be gatekeeper number two could say, hey, to access that particular application, I need you to be MFA. So a decision can be made there. But gatekeeper two does a whole lot more decisions, which I will come to very shortly. Assuming we get through the gatekeepers, the next thing will be to issue a security token, which can be passed back to the application. And we'll also get a priority pass, which could be a cookie, which proves you're authenticated now to Azure AD. So in terms of our users, we could be cloud only. We could be synced up from on-prem. And synchronization could be via Azure AD Connect Sync, or it could be via Azure AD Cloud Sync, or it could be via a combination of those two methods. If we're a guest, we're going to actually be authenticated by a different IDP, identity provider. We're going to get authenticated somewhere else. But in terms of make a conditional access decision, that will be done in our own tenant. So in terms of external users, we could have an external user from another Azure AD tenant. We could have an external user as using a Microsoft account, or it's referred to as an MSA. We might have a user that is coming using a Google account, and we've got a federation with Gmail. So we can set up and federate directly with Gmail. We can federate directly with Facebook, and then we can have what these called direct federations, which is a federation to other IDPs. So it doesn't matter, it's SAML based. So you might have another organization which is running, Ping. You might have another one that is running Okta. And what we can do is using that, we can actually, decide that we authenticate via federation. If we can't authenticate via federation, Microsoft now uses this thing called OTP, which I'll come back on in a second. So the first thing is, gatekeeper number one wants to know how you're going to authenticate. Well, you provide your credentials, and from that, it can make a decision. So this guy said, I'm Blake Peter at Gmail. The gatekeeper one says, we have a federation with Gmail, so please go off to the correct authentication booth. All right. So that's one possibility. Now, if you are not coming from another Azure AD, you're not using a Microsoft account, we don't have federation with Gmail or Facebook, we don't have any direct federations, then the Microsoft solution now is to use this thing called one-time passcode. And what one-time passcode does for you, it effectively emails the user a password, which is used for this one time. So I almost like the term, it's sort of self-federation. You are basically proofing yourself via your email address. Prior to OTP, Microsoft did some quite nasty things with spinning up things like viral tenants, etc. But OTP is the way to go if you do not satisfy any of the other authentication methods. So once we've got everyone going through our Azure AD, the next thing is we've come through the appropriate authentication booth. It's now to enforce that policy, that security policy, which Gatekeeper 2 and 3 are going to do. And if you look at CA policy, and I could easily happily spend 2 or 3 hours on this, but I want to really just give you the absolute essence of this. CA policy is about, it's saying if principal X, and principal X could be a user, it could be an actual workload, wants to access resource Y. Now, resource Y used to be just an application. It can now be a workflow or an action. And the action could be that you are putting in your security details, or you are registering with Intune. So resource Y applies not only to applications, but also workflows. And then says, principal X wants to access resource Y and conditions A to G are met. I'll come to what they are in a second. The policy applies. If the policy applies, you could block access, right? You could block it completely, or you can allow access, or you can say, I will allow access provided requirements L to Q are satisfied. And I'll come to those in a second as well. Now, if you allow access, the next thing we can do is we can put in place session controls. So this is a sort of very quick summary of this. So we're creating a new group policy. We've got our conditions A to G. So our first condition is, who does the policy apply to? All right. And it could be a user, it could be a user by your group membership, it could be an administrative role thing, or rather than just being a user, it could be an actual workload identity of some kind, which could just be an application. So who does this policy apply to? The next thing is for access to which application and actions. So this is saying, the policy applies going to this application. Could be all applications, right? It could be all applications except, and one of the really powerful things about conditional access is the ability to exclude. So we can do everything except. The next thing is the condition, the risk. Now, if you're going to do conditional access, you need a P1 license. If you're going to bring risk into the frame, then you need a P2 license and identity protection. So risk is about user risk. Simplest thing think about that as leak credentials and sign-in risk. So we're coming from a dodgy IP address of some kind. That would be a sign-in risk. And it's very simplest thing. Next thing is we consider the device that's actually being used. Then we can go on to location, and location could be based on IP address. It could be based on GPS location now. So you can take GPS location in. We've then got the client app. So you're coming from a browser, you're coming from a desktop, and so on. The next thing is we say, okay, you've met all these conditions, so we're going to apply this group policy to you. Right? If you didn't meet the conditions, the policy doesn't apply. So now we've got the option of blocking your access, granting your access, or granting your access subject to certain requirements. So for instance, multi-factor, the device has got to be compliant. You've got to be joined to the domain and joined to Azure. So various requirements that are set in. We might require that you do a password change. So for instance, if user risk has been detected, we absolutely want to do a password change. We might say we would like you to agree to a particular set of terms of use. And you might have terms of use for administrators, and terms of use for normal users. And then you might have terms of use. If you go into this application, you need to sign up to a different terms of use. So you might have multiple terms of use that people have to agree to. This is very, very much a work in progress, and expect to see conditional access changes as we go through. It's absolutely core to Zero Trust. It's the core setting of Zero Trust. You can take signals and you can enhance them. So I've already talked about identity and session risk. For that, you need a P2 license. You need to be using Azure AD identity protection. If you want to bring in device compliance, then you will need Intune or a third-party MDM solution of some kind. You can enhance these further with the Defender product. So we got Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. I'll explain a little bit more about what these guys do in a minute. Defender for Identity, which is bringing telemetry from on-prem. And then you've got Defender for Endpoint, which is bringing telemetry from the endpoints. Now, if we decide to issue this token, which allows this user to access this application, the next thing we can do is bring in session controls. So now we've issued a token to access SharePoint. But what we can do is we can say use app enforced restrictions. So now we can pass through, for instance, device compliance to SharePoint. And SharePoint can look at the thing and say, oh, that device is not compliant. I'm not going to allow you in. Well, if it's for the whole of SharePoint, you might as well do it with conditional access. But if it's to an individual website in SharePoint, we could say, oh, yeah, you can access this one, this one, and this one. You don't need a compliant device. But to access this site, you do. So we need to pass that information through to SharePoint. Use conditional access app control is extremely powerful. And what that does for us is, as having provided a token that proves the user's authentication to an application, we actually pass the user, doesn't go directly to the application, they're actually passed through the Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps proxy. Right? And the proxy can look at what's going on in that session. So you could be looking for file downloads. You could be looking for accessing sensitive information. And that is extremely powerful. It really enhances conditional access, because now we're looking at, yes, we've issued a token, but now we're controlling what's going on in that session. You can set sign-in frequency, and you can also set persistent versus session tokens or cookies, if you like, in the browser. So if we take the factor of assumed breach, we've got to know what's going on in our system. And we can use the Defender products for doing that. So Defender for Identity brings instrumentation up from on-prem. All right, so we're getting identity behavior from on-prem being brought into the cloud. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint enhances our endpoint protection, so we can bring more information in from that. You've got Defender for Cloud, which is dealing with your Azure workloads and potentially other cloud platforms as well. Defender for Cloud Apps is immensely powerful, but one of its most powerful components is the way of enhancing conditional access by being able to put in this session control. So we got the control of the session. But it's immensely helpful for eliminating shadow IT, finding out exactly what apps are being used in your environment, and so on. Microsoft Defender for Office 365 is looking about emails, links, collaboration tools, and so on. So protecting against threats from emails and links. There's Defender for this, Defender for that, Defender for something else. And the problem is each one had its own portal, right? Now there's a attempt to unify everything through 365 Defender. And this is going to be a one-stop shop for absolutely all the defenders at some point in time. It's getting better and better all the time. It's improving. And how do we go searching? How do we go threat hunting? How we do our analytics? We hopefully should be able to do it all through the Microsoft 365 Defender portal. So we don't need to go off and use all the other portals. Question that I always get is, should I still use a SIM? And the answer is probably, because a SIM will give you that overall global picture of not only, what's going on exactly on-prem, but going on in different clouds that you might be working with. It also gives you the advantage of pulling in the event logs and bringing in all that sort of detail. But I would think about bringing in a SIM to do the overall consolidation after I'd deployed my Defender products, and use my Defender products as the first, assume breach detection. But you might well want to, it depends how big your operations department is. Bringing in Defender products is a lot of work. There's a lot of learning involved. And so, bringing in a SIM on top of that, and that would probably be, if you're going with Microsoft Stable, it would be Sentinel. Again, another big piece of work. Now, if we look at least privilege operation, what we need to do is define RBAC roles. We need to define scoping for those roles as well. So we're going to allow delegation over a particular set of objects. If we look at identity governance, P2, we get RBAC and privileged identity management. And you will need that if you want to scope it across, if you're going to use administrative units. The other beautiful thing about the governance package, it has access packages in it, which I'll talk a little bit more about. Second, does your lifecycle management. It allows you also to do access reviews. And then the other thing you need to think about in terms of least privilege is managing and monitoring consent. And this is where we're talking about OAuth 2 consent, and we're consenting to an application having access. And it could be through a delegated access, but we want to be very sure that we haven't over consented to things. Very, very typical is over consent, and we need to block on that as well. RBAC, yeah, there's lots and lots and lots of roles, but actually what you want is RBAC with PIM. And then you can basically give someone a administrative role scoped over a particular administrative unit, and then they are eligible but not active. And then you make them active, they do their work, and they can bring themselves down from being active to just being eligible again. So you really do need the P2 license so that you can do the privileged identity management. And then you've got the ability of doing access reviews. Now, one of the particular features of governance that I really like is access packages. And if you think about your tenant, it's got lots and lots and lots of resources in it, lots of applications, lots of groups, lots of SharePoint sites. And what we want to do is when a user joins, and it might be joining the company or might be joining a project, we want to be able to give that user access to certain resources. And we do that by creating an access package. And then in terms of assigning the user, we can have policies, and we can have policies for internal users and policies for external users. and you can do workflow around there, approvals. If you saw my previous webinar, I talked about using verified IDs to prove that maybe you've done a training course before you actually get access to a package. The beauty of access packages is that they are totally designed for delegation. So I can have a catalog creator. Catalog creator works for a department, maybe the legal department, and works out all the applications, all the groups, all the sites that are needed for anything to do with the legal department and places them in the catalog. And then you have a maybe a case administrator, and what the case administrator does is manages the actual access packages which are dealing with a particular legal case. And so we delegation to the catalog manager, we got the access package manager, we got delegation, and then the access package manager can assign users to access packages, or in fact the users can use my access to request access themselves. So it's really done nicely, the delegation that goes along with this. Now that gives you a quick sort of overview of what's involved. So what we need to do is make sure that we have a really rock solid identity access management system. Everything is being funneled through it, so we can then, before making a decision as to whether we're going to allow access to an app, we have got the conditional access policy enforcement engine. And as I say, keep an eye on that because it's being enhanced on a fairly regular basis. In terms of taking this road, is check your current environment is recoverable, right? Make sure that you've got MFA on, all right? Get that on. And then once you consolidate your IAM, you can then evaluate every request for every resource and apply the appropriate conditional access policies. And then least privilege, implement that, and then of course assume breach. And when you're assuming breach, you're going to maybe use data labeling for information protection. You're adding your defenses to minimize the chance of breach, but use analytics to find out what's going on, maybe improve protection and do automatic remediation as well. If you're interested in all things authentication, registering apps in the Azure AD, understanding the federation protocols, understanding where Azure AD application proxy fits in, all the slightly tricky things about Azure AD, then my Identity Masterclass is the one to come on and enjoy. I've been running it for years now, constantly updating it, but never had a single person that didn't really enjoy it and benefit from it. Full details at learn.xdseminars.co.uk. I'm so sort of convinced that you will enjoy it. There's a money-back guarantee if you have a problem. There are some booking terms and conditions that detail about the money-back guarantee. There's nothing complicated. It's just basically you have to turn up, you have to take part in and try and get the most out of the course. But if you're interested, have a look at that as well. Again, look at learn.xdseminars.co.uk for all of that information. And then what would be very useful, we spend an awful lot of time putting these things together. And what would be very, very useful is if you could provide some feedback. There's a QR code there. If we check the chat window, they should, oh yes, it's got in the chat window. If you have a look at the link that's in there, so either with a QR code or with the link. And that really, I know it's 59 minutes, so not bad timing. So that brings us to the end of the webinar, and I can thank you all for coming. I hope you found it a useful hour while you're hanging on beyond the hour. So maybe it was useful. I'll have to maybe take the assumption it was. There's so much in this subject. You could go on forever.
Thanks for watching my channel. Subscribe for more free training. You might like to join me for my Identity Masterclass. Hopefully, see you soon.